issue. But a couple of weeks ago, I was lucky this month in that I got to be in Michigan twice in a month while the leaves were coming out, and we don't get that in Oklahoma and Arkansas, but for about a week. And so I was very happy to get the chance to be here. But I was at Michigan State a couple of weeks ago, and they had a sovereignty discussion within their law review and a continuing education piece. And the idea there by one of your tribal members was, what if Indian country decided that as a sovereign statement, they don't want the rest of the world to look at them as human rights violators, and that just like every other country that is recognized to be part of the UN or these big international organizations, that there are these generally accepted principles of human rights, that governments don't do certain things to people or there would be sovereign ramifications. But tribes can't participate in those processes because they're not recognized internationally as the same stature of nation states. And her proposal is, well, what if we just did that on our own? And we said, they might not recognize us as nation states internationally, but we're saying that we are. And we enter into a treaty with all the other tribes in our area, and maybe that we're culturally connected with, or maybe that we're not, so that we have some external pressure on ourselves, even though it's external tribal pressure, to do the right thing vis-a-vis our people. And so when there's citizens who are claiming that they've been fraudulently disenrolled, or when there's citizens who say the tribal government has violated my civil rights, and they don't feel that they can get any remedy in their own court, is there some other external accountability that we might go to? And so we were talking about, in an academic setting, why or why not that would work, you know? And first answer was, well, everyone would be very raw sovereignty, and I'm not giving up my sovereignty to this external piece because I don't want anybody on the outside telling my tribal government what it can and can't do. And then I talked about something that it's kind of running through the theme of this talk too, where I talked about that we have a sovereignty self-esteem problem, in that we don't think about our sovereignty the way that we think of every other government's sovereignty. And part of that, again, is by maybe the way our own community culturally thinks about what a government is. Maybe it's an outgrowth of what the federal government tells us we have the power to do, but maybe it's some collective thing of all of these items that I'm talking about, where, for better or worse, our people just don't think about our government as having the same legitimate powers as other governments, and why is that? Okay? So that culture of disconnect is well, the tribe should be able to do this, but they can't write me a ticket for a hacking violation, or the tribe ought to be able to do this, but they can't impose this tax on me. And I think part of connecting that cultural, or that disconnect between what the tribe's government says our sovereignty is versus the citizens think our sovereignty is, when it means that it's sovereign acted upon the citizens. Right? I think there's uniformity in Indian country when we think about tribal sovereignty, when we think about sovereignty, tribe versus state, or tribe versus the federal. Yeah, we have all the sovereignty in the world when we posture it this way. But as tribal citizens, and we think about what is it that the tribal government can and can't do to me, then that changes that dynamic of how sovereign we think our government ought to be. And part of that has to do with whether we trust our governments, and part of it has to do with whether we feel fully engaged that there would be a remedy there. Another example of that, and you'll have to forgive me, Alec, because you've heard this one once before, but 7 years ago, I gave a talk at the Federal Bar Conference out in Albuquerque, and that's the biggest one. There's about 700 attorneys out there, and it is a rah-rah sovereignty fest. It's 2 or 3 days of go get re-energized, we're gonna fight the man, our sovereignty comes first, no matter what, and you've got the Department of Justice, Indians who've gone to DC and then they come out there for a couple days and they're ready to go home and be tribal attorney again, and it's this real re-enthusiasm of what tribal sovereignty is. And so I'm giving a talk about the federal government and how bad they've screwed up trust lands and trust money management. It's right in the middle of Cobell. And so, I said, well, how many of you are happy with the way the federal government's, dealing with our lands? Oh, no. How many think we need a new system? Yeah, we need a new system. How many of you, have allotments? Well, I've got an allotment. Well, how many of you would allow and be happy about, instead of the federal government being the trustee over your lands, let's just shift it over and have the tribe be the trustee over the lands? And they all just went white in the face, right? Like, my tribal government is not going to administer my trust funds. And these are the people who are charged with being the frontline, legal warriors. But when it came to their tribe and their family's allotment, they were just as uncomfortable with that as they are with the BIA or the Office of Special Trustee having those kind of powers. And again, I scratch my head and I make a little fun of it, but maybe it again gets back to the way that Native people, or in some tribes at least, think about what a government ought to do versus what's the generally acceptable principles of governmental power. And then I'm going to say this last line. This is the other point that I think I'm seeing in the tribes I'm working with, is this growing divide between tribal governments do and what other governments do. And what I mean by this is the setting of priorities, okay? Tribal councils have it tough because they've got, a handful of people and usually 1 or 2 attorneys advising them. And there's all this pressure from the outside world. You need a uniform commercial code. You need a new domestic violence code. You need every kind of code in the world. You need to hurry up and write some legislation about it because you don't have anything on the books to exercise that piece of sovereignty. But what is the highest demand for most tribal councils right now is how are we going to fund ourselves because we don't have a tax base. And so, for better or worse, oftentimes the priorities of what gets attention for legislation and discussions in meetings and that type of thing tends to be more on the economic development side, right? Do we enter a compact with this county for X so that we can do Y? Do we go after this diversification of our business because the revenues are down from our casinos over here? Or we're doing really well here, do we go off with another economic development venture at the same time? And then what do we not do? Well, we don't issue driver's licenses, the basic thing that every sovereign across our globe, tends to do. Why? Well, we'll just let the state deal with that, okay? And the tax issue I've raised and things like that. But very basic fundamental things that all other governments do, we just don't do because we're so concentrated on the economic development side. And it's not an indictment because, we have to figure out a way to fund our government services because we don't have some of those other powers. But all of that, I think, sends this implicit message to our tribal people of where do they have to go get their driver's license? Over here. So are they a Michigan citizen? Yeah, right? And when they think about governance, what do they think about? These very basic no-brainer type government service things that they go elsewhere for versus what do they come to the tribe for? And it's back to this, my benefits I come to the tribe for. But when it talks about government services, really, I'm going over here. For roads, for things like that. When internal problems become external problems, okay? And now I'm going to kind of get to the shift of what happens when your tribal citizens feel completely disengaged in the process, right? That when either they feel like they don't know what's going on in the tribal government, or they feel like their voices aren't heard, or their priorities aren't being met, and they just disengage and decide to only look at the tribe in a certain way. Now that can go a couple of different directions. You can have the, I'm disengaged in my head, but totally engaged with my free speech tribal member that is on every blog and every Facebook page blasting the tribal government. Those are not the people I call disengaged. I call them highly engaged because they're the ones that they're paying the most attention to what the tribe is doing, even though they're negatively critiquing what the tribe is doing. But those people are highly engaged, okay? Then there's the people who maybe come to the annual meeting, maybe vote in elections, but if you ask them, what's the tribal government doing this week, what's council voting on next month, when was the last time we did X, Y, and Z, or there's some economic development project that doesn't have the tribe brand on it, and they would have no clue that that's the tribe doing that. It's just sort of a go with the flow. And that's the basic all-American kind of person, right? I'm feeding my kids, I'm walking the dog, I'm working my job, and I don't have time to think about that kind of stuff. And then you have the actively disengaged people who have never voted in their whole life, could care less what the tribal government is doing until they need a scholarship or something like that. And that's kind of the continuum. Now, I have here what happens when those internal problems now have external ramifications. And the first bullet point here is the highly engaged but disgruntled tribal member on this end, okay? And the problem there is that those are the people who tend to get so fired up that they feel disengaged and you're not giving them information, that they will go lobby externally against tribal interests, okay? So you have things like back in the late 60s when we had the Indian Civil Rights Act passed in Congress, right? How did that get passed? Congress is not sitting around in all of their spare time thinking about tribal courts are disenfranchised or are not giving people due process or not giving people trials. What happened? You know, for lack of a better term, there were some pissed off tribal members who either got a raw deal in their government or felt like they didn't have due process or got their kids taken away and then didn't get a court hearing or something like that, whether it's reality or in their head. They're fired up because they feel like tribal governments don't have to have the same civil rights accountabilities as others, and so let's go try to do something about it. So that's an extreme example where we now get this Indian Civil Rights Act imposed on tribal governments that now till the end of time, we can never have jurisdiction sentencing above 1 or 3 years. We can only hear these certain kinds of cases, and it's damning on tribal sovereignty, but you push people to the point by not giving them an internal voice that you have that. Now, I'm not saying that fixing a website and engaging your tribal members are gonna stop that, but it could cut down on it if they felt like that there was a voice that they had locally where, you know, the folks that went to lobby Congress at the time, at least the testimony was that, you know, things were happening and they would go to a tribal council meeting and they would shut the door and not even let them talk. And so you push fringe behavior by completely excluding people from the process. The second point, declining access, I misspelled my slides, access to financing and economic development because of perceived instability or disenfranchised voters. All right, this is the one that I think is very real, and that's the example of when investors in declining economic times are deciding where to invest their money and whether a tribal government or tribal community is a safe enough bet. And this perceived instability, okay? Now that could go 2 ways, right? Maybe if your tribal people are so disenfranchised that you have one tribal chair that's in there for 55 years, right, and could never be voted out, and you've got the same tribal council. On one hand, I'm an investor, and I say, that's rock solid, right? That's like investing in some South American countries because I know these people are going to be in charge because they have such a heavy hand that no one is going to mess with them. So I might go ahead on that end of the continuum and invest in the government. But most likely, that perceived instability by just having very few people participate in the process could lead to situations where you're not going to have outside investors be as comfortable. And maybe it's that they'll still give you the money. But I've been working with a lot of people who are economists, and they're their own breed of people. But I've been working with some economists that are really trying to look at why some tribal economies thrive and why others don't. And they're looking at political participation and process. And you know, the bottom line here is that perceived instability might not mean that you can't get a loan, but they're tracking over a couple of decades the loan terms that tribes get based on perceived external instability. And you know, the interest rates and the various items in those agreements, where there is a smooth political process and there's a good, strong court system, and there's what appears to be to the outside world more community engagement, you tend to get better terms across the board in those, which means there's going to be bottom dollar more for the tribe over that time, so long as the economic development ventures pan out. The second point, disenfranchisement of voters and the community leads to a perceived concentration of power and corruption. We talked about that, where if you're, and by chance, I mean, I'll talk about how bad my own tribes is. We have over 300,000 tribal members, and our last 2 tribal elections, we had less than 20,000 people vote. And part of that, I think, is that we have even more of a local citizen concentration base versus people who live throughout the country than you all do. We're more at 10 to 15% local than everybody else all over the globe, where I think you all are closer to the 25-75 split. But just by chance, what is voter participation here? Do you have any idea? you have enough information to know.
Isn't it around, we've got about 2,000